and introduce myself and Virginia while people are getting logged on. We are recording tonight's program, so we'll be happy to send out the link to everybody who's registered, and it'll also be able to be viewed on Historic Milwaukee's YouTube page. So thanks everyone for registering, for joining for this wonderful presentation with Virginia Small. My name is Grace Four. I'm the events director for Historic Milwaukee. We're very excited to be able to host this program virtually and expect a much larger audience than we'd be able to host in person. So that's kind of the beauty and silver lining of the pandemic, is allowed us to introduce this sort of technology to Historic Milwaukee. So thanks everybody for logging on. Virginia Small is an award-winning journalist and author. She's been writing and speaking about landscapes and environmental issues for more than 25 years. So we are really excited to have Virginia join us this evening. We're up to over 70 people logged on so far. And I'm sure that we'll have more join us throughout the hour. If you have any questions, I welcome you to use the chat and Q&A function, and we'll probably get to all of those at the end of the program. We'll be running till about 6:50 with the presentation, and then leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. So I'll let Virginia take it from here. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Grace, and thanks to Historic Milwaukee for hosting this event. And as Grace said, to take advantage of this opportunity to do a virtual presentation. I would love to be in person with everyone joining us tonight, but I thank you for joining in here online. And I'm really excited to be able to share this journey with you this evening. So the title of my program is Frederick Law Olmsted's Enduring Legacies in Milwaukee. And we will be going through a lot of slides that are contemporary as well as historic archival footage. So why talk about the past? Well, Plato said, study the past is prologue. And in terms of landscapes, often the past is almost invisible. So much of what we'll be seeing and talking about this evening are things that maybe we just are familiar with, but not really even aware that they are playing a role in our daily lives and how we move through the world, how we move through Milwaukee. So first, I would like to acknowledge that in Milwaukee, we are on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the southwest shores of Michigami, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnick rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. Land acknowledgements help us to remember these nations and the ancestors who were stewards of the places where we live. And I acknowledge the Electoquini Institute for providing that. And here we are. This is Lake Park, and this is just a little bit off of Locust Street. There is an Indian mound and a marker. And it's one of the reasons that Lake Park is on the National Register of Historic Places. And we'll just look at this marker for a second. It's a prehistoric burial mound, the last of a group of Indian mound that were created as part of a Stone Age village. There you can read the full text. I won't read this whole thing here, but basically this is the last of two known prehistoric burial mounds in Milwaukee. There were as many as 200 that Increase Lapham, Wisconsin's first scientist and an early citizen of Milwaukee, documented, but most sadly were not respected and retained. So I'd also like to acknowledge what I've learned a lot over the years since I've been back in Milwaukee for about 10 years about these legacies. I really am standing on a lot of big shoulders. And I had discovered Olmsted while I was away from Milwaukee. And but when I returned, these are some of the people whose work and study and research I have been grateful to be able to draw on. And that's Diane Buck, Carlin Hadala, Virginia Palmer, Lynn Goldstein, Marcia Coles, Marguerite Harvey, Joanne Barnt, Dolores Knopfelmacher, Gil Walter, the Lake Park Friends History Committee, Whitney Gould, Jennifer Current, Anna Marie Sawkins, and many, many more. And this bench that is in the foreground is actually a memorial to my late sister-in-law, Catherine Porter Small, who was an American studies teacher at Nicolet. And she's the one who first told me, when I was telling her I was in a landscape design course, that she told me that, that Frederick Law Olmsted designed Lake Park and Washington Park. And I said, no, I did not know, even though I had been in those parks and loved them since my at least my teens and 20s. So who is Frederick Law Olmsted? Well, he's considered the father of American landscape architecture, and also many people call him the father of American urban parks. So there's two pictures of him at different points of his life. And he's just an amazing person that was a Renaissance man, an autodidact. All of his learning was pretty much on his own. And he learned first and foremost from nature. He was constantly in nature. And so different people there's been many biographies of Olmsted, and here are just a couple of the phrases that people have used to describe him. So he was always farsighted and a trailblazer, whether as a scientific farmer, one of his early careers, an author, a journalist, a park maker, publisher, or early conservationist. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those aspects of his career, but biographers have variously called Olmsted a practical utopian, a man of vision who could get things done, which is not always in the same person, a genius of place, and I like this one especially, the most important American historical figure that the average person knows least about. So I hope maybe after this, you'll know a little bit more about Olmsted. So one of the things that many people don't realize, and this is a new book about Olmsted and Yosemite, and the subtitle is Civil War, Abolition, and the National Park Idea. And he wrote a report in 1865 about protecting and conserving Yosemite for all. Now, there's a whole sub-story to this of how he ended up in California. This was after he had served as the sanitation commissioner for the Civil War, working directly with President Lincoln and others who were leading the fight for the northern side. And it was just part of what Olmsted would do. He would find himself somewhere and he would be so observant and take the position of what is it that needs to be done here. And this is eventually how he became the park maker that he became. So here's a few of the books either by or about Olmsted. He did a great deal of writing, and they're collected in numerous texts. I don't have a picture of the Cotton Kingdom, but that was a very influential book that collected the writings that he did as a journalist for the New York Times. For about 3 years, he was a roving journalist in the South, and he documented the horrors of slavery and actually giving voice to people in all parts of the South, and including enslaved people. And that work really was the first that helped people to understand the true conditions of what was happening there. And also he became an anti-slavery activist eventually. And then this book, Spying on the South, a fairly recent book, retraces all of those travels and checks in with where things are today in that. Another couple of books, it was a biography that was very popular, still very popular, and then one of the books about his landscapes, and that's a picture from Central Park. So now, how did Olmsted come to be who he was? Well, he didn't come to all of this and come up with everything that we see in his designs. He actually was also in a line of people whose work he learned of and emulated and learned from. So, but the Andrew Jackson Downing was an early influential tastemaker and advocate for a central park in New York City. He was a landscape gardener. His family had a nursery in Newburgh, New York. And he was still a very young man, but he was publishing the Horticulturist, which was the Journal of Rural Art and Rural Taste. And this was a leading monthly and the first publication devoted to horticulture and the rural arts. It included articles on scientific farming, landscape gardening, horticulture, architecture, and more. And this was a way for the magazine tried to help people to decide how to plant things, where to plant, and how to beautify actually even a modest homestead. So Frederick Law Olmsted was among its contributors, and that's how they met. And then he also met Calvert Vaux. Now, Andrew Jackson Downing had met Calvert Vaux in England in 1850 and enticed him to come and be his partner and move to America. So together they began designing projects such as the White House grounds and the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. And then tragically in 1852, just 2 years later, Andrew Jackson Downing died in a steamboat accident. So as a result, then Calvert Vaux was also kind of at loose ends. But around the same time, Frederick Law Olmsted was traveling in England with kind of in a roughing it tour for about 5 months with his brother and some of his brother's friends, including Charles Loring Brace, who became a major reformer in American life. But he visited many places, but one of the places he visited was Birkenhead Park, which was the first public park in Liverpool. It was in Liverpool. It was one of the first public park in England designed just for that purpose, not a royal park that was then converted for public use. And so it's interesting, you'll see these curving lines and such. This was the design was by Joseph Paxton. So then, you're going to take a few leaps here, but eventually Olmsted, after his work as a journalist, he found out about a position to be the superintendent of the park that was being created called Central Park in New York City. But at the time, they decided to have a competition to redesign what had been already designed and people weren't happy with. And so it was that Calvert Vaux asked him to join him in entering a design, which they did. And this was called the Greensward Plan, which is on the lower portion of this image, of this picture. And it was a very ambitious and innovative design, and it won. So then in 1858, they began making Central Park. And this was the first of anything like this in America, and it still is regarded just one of the most exceptional parks anywhere. So Olmsted, as part of his travels and part of his awareness of the issues of, especially of plantation life and everything, he really believed that we needed parks for all people. And he was always considering what would serve the future and those to come. So that includes all the people here that are in these parks today. This is in Prospect Park. But he also considered it essential to democracy. Like, the democracy is something that's essentially a big experiment. And at that point, it was even more experimental. And he believed that we needed to have places for all people to be on equal footing. So at this point, one of the park systems that Olmsted designed, it was the first park system, was in Buffalo, New York. And I just want to pause for a second and take note of this. And my hearts, and I'm sure all of our hearts are with those in Buffalo who have suffered such a tragedy. And I dearly hope that their parks are places of respite for everyone in this really, really trying time. So other places, this is one of the parks in Milwaukee where people are gathering in great masses. This is at Humboldt Park, Chill on the Hill, which is one of the parks that actually Olmsted has a slight role in that, at least in the selection of that park. So Olmsted designed Boston's linear park system called the Emerald Necklace, and the Muddy River portion is considered America's first green infrastructure project. It was designed to help keep the river from flooding. That project is being restored and returned to its more natural and original design that Olmsted developed. But development had changed a lot of the conditions over time, and so they're trying to sort of restore that. So another project was the Capitol grounds. The U.S. The Capitol steps was actually something that Olmsted came up with as a way to anchor the Capitol in the landscape. And there's just so many places. Another one is the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina. This was also the site of the first managed forestry project. Now, and that was where Gifford Pinchot, who became the first director of the U.S. Forest Service, he was working on that project. So this is a map of the Olmsted firm's project locations. Now, the Olmsted firm included descendant firms that were headed by his two sons. We'll see a picture of them in a minute. But as you can see, the predominant concentration of Olmsted projects is east of the Mississippi. So Wisconsin has a certain amount, and most of the ones that were Olmsted Senior, we'll call him, that they were in this Milwaukee area. But there's also projects in Lake Geneva and Sheboygan and Kohler. So, but if you can see, I mean, there's just this real dense area along the eastern seaboard. And I was really fortunate to live in Connecticut and see many of those Olmsted projects, of course, many times in Central Park, but also throughout Connecticut, Massachusetts, and other places, New York. So one of the mottos of people in the era when Olmsted was living, and in really even since, was there's a phrase, consult the genius of the place in all. And this was a line by Alexander Pope, a British poet. And at the time, there was a lot of people who were considering landscape as a place to really think about things and to see things and write. And there was a lot of attention paid. So what does it mean to consult the genius of a place? Well, in many respects, it's to see what is there. And in terms of, say, Lake Park, the fact that this is directly a bluff that overlooks Lake Michigan, the existing features are part of the genius of the place, the character, and it's the kind of thing that you see by being somewhere for a while. And Olmsted had an exceptional gift for walking around a place and just seeing what it was that was special about it. So in how is it that Olmsted came to Milwaukee to begin with? Well, first we have to go back a little bit, and that is that he was working for the World's Columbia exhibition in Chicago, which is also called the World's Fair. So he was in charge of designing the landscapes for this major exhibition, along with Daniel Burnham, the architect in chief. And so he was very busy there, and there was an awareness of Olmsted. He was by then, this is toward the end of his career, and he was very well known. And so there was someone in Milwaukee named Christian Wall, who, after he sold his glue business in Chicago, returned to Milwaukee and devoted himself to helping the city develop parks for all, as championed by Olmsted. Now, he had been here about 6 years by then. In 1890, when the Park Commission, City of Milwaukee's Park Commission was formed. And there had been debates for about 30 years. Should Milwaukee have public parks? Were the beer gardens enough? Were the were the amusement parks, which were private. But wasn't that enough? And then there were these little plazas and squares, one in each of the aldermanic wards. But there was a push, and there was succeeded, and so this park commission decided to help to create a system of parks and parkways, which was a concept that was, of course, created by Olmsted and Vaux. So the new park board went to Wall went down to Chicago, enlisted Olmsted to help them select the sites, and then he would design 3 of them of his choosing. He corresponded until about 1892 when he came on the first of 4 visits. So during that time, when Olmsted was consulting with the sites, and they were describing them and where they were and all that, he was urging them to have a park that was actually more centrally located, closer to downtown. And because Lake Park was really kind of on the edge of town, as was West Park, wasn't even in Milwaukee at that point. It was part of Wauwatosa, and that they were in pretty much undeveloped areas. Of course, Olmsted knew that the city would grow to them, and he did favor that. And the other parks that were chosen at that time were eventually named Riverside, Sherman, Mitchell, Kosciuszko, and Humboldt. Of course, they all had different names pretty much at that point, so we won't call them that. So here's some of the things that Olmsted ended up doing for Milwaukee's parks. This is one of the many drawings. This is a preliminary plan for Washington Park, or was then West Side Park. And what they did, they had many planting plans and elevation plans and this and that. So the firm, which included his son of John Charles Olmsted, he was on the team, and there were others. It was a small group, but that was John Charles was involved, and he had been working with Olmsted for about 20 years by then. So one of the things that we'll talk about, what was the legacy that the legacies, you could say, that Olmsted brought to Milwaukee. He and his colleagues influenced many aspects of life, including the fostering of democracy through Parks for All People, the aesthetics of parks and other green spaces here, and we'll see some of that in a moment, urban planning and ideas about connectivity, which wasn't the word they used then, but that's what it's all about. The introduction of parkways and green boulevards, which was something that people were already aware of, that Olmsted was doing this in other places. The development of an interlinked park system, mass transit serving early parks to make them accessible. This was as early as 1895 with streetcars, and then making the city livable and green. And so all of this still remains relevant. Here we have just a sense of place here. This is a wonderful place if you're ever in Boston and can visit Fairstead in Brookline. This is the home and office where Olmsted eventually moved, and it's now a National Park Service historic site. And this is where Olmsted worked and lived. And it was an old farmhouse that he built, expanded upon. And there's both of his sons. John Charles Olmsted is actually his nephew and stepson, whom he adopted along with his siblings. And that's another whole story. But anyway, so whoops. So the group that came to Milwaukee, one of the approaches that they worked with, and Olmsted's approach, was basically to choose sites based on their natural resources and to have a diversity of geographic locations. And each park would serve all residents and also help attract development to the respective neighborhood. Now, the reason that the idea of a system was that everyone would be able to use all of the parks. They would not be strictly neighborhood parks by any means. And so the different resources and the different attributes would draw people to them, and that everyone could use them. So they wouldn't be identical in any sense. They would all have their own features. So activities were planned. In this case, the river was a great place for swimming at that point, no longer, or it wasn't for a long time, but maybe someday it will return to that. There was also things like the lagoon was created in Washington Park. That was a designed feature. You also had, so here's a little series of each of the parks and some of the early the postcards, which was a very popular way to promote awareness of these parks and other parks too. But I think you see a lot of these postcards, and many of them were of the Olmsted parks. This is Riverside Park, and you can see across the river to Gordon Park over there. There was quite a big pavilion there. And here's Lake Park and the promenade, a favorite promenade. This was one of the ideas that Olmsted had seen in the park in Birkenhead, where he saw a promenade, and he believed that this was a way for people to engage with each other in public without having to know each other and interact that much at a deep level, but to be able to be in spaces together. And I think this is still a very important part of what public parks do, is that we can share our humanity just by being in the space together. Here's some wonderful images. This is when Lake Park had below the steps had the balustrades there. I mean, there was another whole area that was an overlook down below. And here's Newberry Boulevard. This was also part of the design. It would connect Lake Park with River Park, and people were able to go either by foot or in carriages or whatever, horseback, all the way from the lake, all the way down to the river, and then back up again to what's now Locust Avenue. Then Newberry Boulevard is on the National Register. It's also, as is Lake Park. And this is one of the aspects of these parks. They are considered really significant nationally, not just to us here in Milwaukee. So one of the hallmarks of Olmsted is that everything he designed, he wanted it to be a holistic experience. He was always talking about unity. So all elements were subordinated to achieve a unified flowing design. He wanted to create respite within nature to promote well-being for all. This was something that he believed. He suffered a lot. He had illnesses. He had lost his mother when he was 3. He had his brother tragically died when he was, he had an illness, but he died when he was just 30. And he had a lot of losses and grief in his life. And he always turned to nature, and he believed that everyone should have that. So the parks would also serve passive recreation, which is strolling, picnics, and self-directed play, as well as active areas where there was something specifically going on. And that he also really wanted to foster the quality of ease that flows from the satisfaction of basic human needs: shelter, shade, prospect, and comfort. And he acquired this awareness from his own travels. Even while he was working as a journalist in the South, he was camping. He would select his campsite based on those four issues, and he wrote about that in his journals, and that was quoted in the book Spying on the South. I thought that was really interesting. So, and Olmsted was really amazing, is that he was such a poet, and yet he was so good at logistics and mechanics, and he had all these practical skills in types of engineering, and he was the first to introduce the use of cylindrical drainage tiles during his scientific farming era. But one of the things, one of the quotes I've always loved is, "Landscape moves us in a manner more nearly analogous to the action of music than anything else." And the fact is that because it's kind of washing over us, we may not even know how that is, or that even someone designed it. And so that's part of, I think, the invisible quality of landscape design. Really good landscape architecture doesn't necessarily call attention to itself, and certainly Olmsted's doesn't, except that you feel it. So mainly his approach was naturalistic and scenic. So these parks reflected nature. Existing topography and resources were retained wherever possible, as in these ravines in Lake Park. Olmsted loved this about the Milwaukee topography. The prospects were a favorite element, such as Lake Park's bluff, Riverside's overlook of the river, and Washington Park's rolling hills. And those were all features that existed. And then they might have been enhanced in some way. As far as the Lake Park Ravine, they were just rustic bridges. Of course, in Central Park, he had to create those different levels, which took a whole lot more effort for sure, and time and money and whatever. So natural features were also added and enhanced to achieve specific effects. So a naturalistic setting here that affords passive recreation. You see this scattering of trees and open areas. He called these, sometimes they were called meadows, or it was a pastoral type scene. And this is one of the images from Washington Park. These are terms again that were used in landscape painting and in landscape discussions prior to Olmsted, but he adopted them and gave them some real definition. So the idea of the beautiful, which is very calming, romantic, sort of easy. And in this case, again, the open lawn with scattered trees. You'll see this in most Olmsted landscapes. And then they favored curving and divergent paths and focal points to lead the eye. So the idea of the divergent path, I think once you start to notice that, you'll see that in all of these different landscapes. And it just gives you an opportunity to choose. There's not just one way to go in a park or landscape. And there's this idea that there's something around the corner to explore. And there's also often the trees will be focal points, but they won't be calling attention to themselves in the same way that it's just like a single focal point. So the picturesque is much more dramatic, rugged, rustic, irregular scenery. And they liked this too for contrast. So here's another example of the ravine. This is a rather rugged scene. The lagoon in Washington Park, where someone is walking across one of the bridges, is a more rustic looking scene. And this lagoon, now the lagoon is getting a bit overgrown. It needs some loving. It needs some real care and attention that is going to take some real planning. So now formal elements were used in his designs, but they were done sparingly and often functionally, such as a bridge, a pavilion, or an entryway. There wasn't a lot of, there were buildings in some cases, and we have in Lake Park, but the idea was to subordinate the whole, the elements to the whole experience. Now, one of the big aspects was this idea of circulation. Circulation means how do you get around? This is a rendering. It's not an actual exact way that the park looked, but it was an interpretation of an artist. But you can see in this picture the sense of the flow through the park and over those ravines. So there were always multiple ways to experience each park. And this was before we used the word multimodal. Circulation was designed as a pleasing and orchestrated journey. He used that word orchestrated a lot. Pathways and roads were generally curving with scenes unfolding. So I invite you to look and notice when you're in an Olmsted Park, just see what kind of scenes that unfold and see how they vary and how you feel as they unfold. So here's one example of the belief in mass transit. This is the station that was at the end of Locust Street. That was the streetcar station and the Northwest, I forget the full name, the Chicago and Northwest Railway. And this was done in 1895 at Olmsted's urging. And he said that in order for parks to serve all people, they had to have mass transit for people to reach them. And those streetcars went all the way past the county line out into places where people would otherwise not have been able to come into the city without that transportation. The parks were intended as places for people to gather. This is one of the scenes from Washington Park Wednesdays, one of the great community events with music and other community activities held eight times in the summer. This will be in July and August this year, returning in full swing after COVID. And here's a couple more scenes from Washington Park. There's always a community element as well as the concert. And here's what Music Under the Stars, to go back for some of us, I didn't actually go. I knew all about it. I just was too young to actually be able to attend. But this was the wonderful Art Deco band shell, which came later, but there was originally another band shell in Washington Park. So there was always music in both Washington Park and Lake Park. There's a music concourse in Lake Park on the original plan for the park. And here's our current music stage, summer stage there, it's called in Lake Park. So now if we're going to talk about the legacy of Olmsted in Milwaukee, we have to mention Warren H. Manning. He was a late career protege of Olmsted, including in Milwaukee. He was the designer of Wild Gardens and America's first environmental planner. He was in his 30s when he was working with Olmsted in 1892 and beyond. But there's a whole book written about him that came out a few years ago. But Warren Manning was the planting designer and the superintendent really of the creation of these parks. So he continued to come back to Milwaukee for as a consultant for about a decade, and he worked closely with the City Parks Commission. There in the commissioner's reports, there's a lot of mentions of Mr. Manning doing this and that, and planting trees. And he even had an entire nursery set up in Humboldt Park to be planting and growing on the trees and such that were then planted in these parks. So Warren Manning designed he did those planting plans, and also he designed Kosciuszko and Mitchell Parks, including the Sunken Garden in Mitchell Park when it was expanded. So those legacies, I won't read this whole quote here, but Warren Manning is another fascinating person to study in terms of what was his real influence and role in Milwaukee. And I think it's worthy of much more study. So here's some examples. This was the Sunken Garden, which was removed, I guess, around in the 1990s. But it was originally designed on center with the Victorian Conservatory that was created there. And then it continued, it was the domes when they were designed as the second conservatory, it was also on access for that. And now it's, you can see the railings of that, but it's just the area, you can still see the outline of the landscape, but there is no longer that sunken garden. But here's the lagoon. You see a lot of the same design elements in terms of the landscape, the rolling hills and the lagoon, which was human designed. But there's also just a lot of flowing lines and it's a wonderful place to walk. This is another of Manning's designs. This is Kosciuszko Park. Again, these were all among the first 7 parks that Olmsted helped the commission to select. And choosing the sites was a very big deal because it was the framework of what became the park system. So here's another part of Kosciuszko, and those same there's a lot of rolling hills there. So basically, there were visionary trailblazers that played major roles in Milwaukee County. And in turn, the county built upon that heritage and became a national model for its parks. Several parks and parkways are on the National Register of Historic Places, and the entire park system has been deemed eligible for the National Register. And this was all an outgrowth of first Olmsted's parks were developed and immediately became popular and successful, and there was a desire for more. And then the next phase of the development of the park system was with Charles B. Whitnall. We've heard a lot more of him. There's, of course, he's named for Whitnall Park, and he was known as a sewer socialist, and he was a self-taught civic planner, longtime park commissioner. And there's a lot of credit to Whitnall, but essentially he built upon a lot of the ideas that Olmsted had brought. So his plan for the county system was especially notable for its emphasis on combining together wetland protection, stream bank restoration, flood control, and public public recreation, I'm sorry. But that, again, this was the idea of a necklace of green, which was directly an homage to the emerald necklace in Boston, which Olmsted had developed and which also had the first green infrastructure. So, and then Alfred Burner, and that's Burner Botanical Garden is named for him. He was hired as Milwaukee County's first landscape architect in 1926. The profession of landscape architecture was codified in 1899, and that was with two of Olmsted's sons who were among the founding members. And there's Burner's crowning design achievement is considered Burner Botanical Garden, which is a blend of formal and naturalistic design. So Burner, he studied landscape architecture in two of the first degree programs in the profession, and this was a profession that Olmsted created. So there was no question that he was influenced in terms of his studies by what that profession was, which by then was only about, officially about 30 years old. So you can trace direct lines from Olmsted and Manning to Whitnall and Burner in the park design and philosophy. They built upon, the later designers built upon the concepts of park systems, of linking parks and parkways. And Burner especially was working on building upon the naturalistic landscape, especially reflecting the indigenous Wisconsin landscape. Now, this was something that especially Warren Manning was doing, but Olmsted himself was always aware that the landscapes in different regions look different. So when he designed something out in California, it certainly looked different than what he did out east. Here's a few images from the Burner. So the Oak Leaf Trail, and you can see this is how the links work now. And this was, again, this was a result of the actual system, and the system followed the waterways. This was also something that was done in some other cities, but Milwaukee did it to probably a fuller extent, or I guess really many people say that was the fullest, one of the fullest extents in terms of an entire county. So some of the character defining motifs were established early on. They were retained fairly consistently over several generations. They were refined and updated to meet changing needs, and they began in the city and were continued by the county. So one of the direct results of Olmsted's planning was Lincoln Memorial Drive. It's a parkway. It's an officially named parkway. We don't call it by that name, but it evolved over many decades after Olmsted envisioned a shore drive here. Now, the first shore drive was just at the northern edge of what is now Lincoln Memorial Drive, but eventually the park commissioners figured out that if they filled in the lake bed, that land could only be used for parks. And that was a very intentional plan that started back in the 1890s, and they got permission to get easements. It was something that the state had to grant. And that was the basis for how we got our amazing lakefront. And that land is protected by the public trust doctrine, because that's what was in the state constitution of how that would be treated. Now, all states have some sort of public trust doctrine, and Wisconsin's is one of the best in serving the public's needs, I think. So this legacy of Olmsted, we could talk far longer than I have time for this evening, but we are really the beneficiaries of it. And Olmsted did say that I have all my life been considering distant effects, and he added, sacrificing often the present moment. And he really did consider himself a public servant. This was what he always went back to. And even though people, like his partner Calvert Vaux, really thought of them as artists, and even though he was immensely creative and artistic, he almost always came back to, no, I'm a public servant. And I think we are the beneficiaries of that, and so are so many others throughout the country. And I think that public spiritedness is maybe what the biggest legacy, and we can feel it, we can see it, because we are directly experiencing it as we experience these parks and public spaces and how they serve us today. So I'm going to quote here, though, someone else who has made a mark in Milwaukee, and he was one of Olmsted's best friends and longtime correspondents, even when they didn't live in the same place. He did work with Olmsted for a while in his firm, but then he moved to Chicago, and this was Horace William Shaler Cleveland. And he eventually moved to Chicago, and he became the first person to design a landscape in Wisconsin. And this was in 1872, and this was Juneau Park. And so we won't have a chance to talk about Cleveland all that much. He eventually designed and urged people to buy all the land that formed the park systems in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So, but what he said, and this was another very prescient man who was committed to the future, he said, look forward a century to the time when the city has a population of 1 million and think what will be their wants. He wrote a whole book on this subject about the landscape architecture in the West, which is what we now call the Midwest. So here are some of the places today that we are experiencing. This is how we experience parks today, rather than in long white dresses or long coats and hats. Parks today continue to serve as places for gathering and expression. This is an event at South Shore Park called We Are Water. It's hosted by the Milwaukee Water Commons every year on someplace on Lake Michigan. And that's Kevon Jones there performing. And then here's one of my favorite places, and I'm sure many people, this is one of the views of Lake Michigan from Lake Park. And here are people exploring some of the later developments in Washington Park. These are sculptures that are monuments, and this is a class of people, Marquette University's public history students out on an outing. And then parks change in terms of how they're defined, who they serve. This is the dedication of the Indigenous Peoples Park in Milwaukee County. And certainly we cannot do enough to honor and mark and really incorporate the wisdom of Indigenous peoples in Milwaukee and throughout North America. So here are some other ways that people were enjoying the parks, especially during COVID. There was just so many people everywhere. If you couldn't be even in big groups, at least you could be enjoying nature somewhere in a park. So with that, I guess we're just on time. But there's so much more that we could talk about. And fortunately, there is a wonderful opportunities that will continue for this throughout this year. This is the 200th anniversary of the birth of Frederick Law Olmsted in 1822. And so there's been a celebration going on nationally, and Milwaukee is very much a part of it. So there's an exhibition called In the Park with Olmsted, A Vision for Milwaukee, that is at Villa Terrace, and it continues through September 25th. That's one of the images that the painting of the bridge, the Riverside Road Bridge in Lake Park, that is from the Museum of Wisconsin Art. And I was delighted to discover that painting there. There is also going to be a book talk hosted by Boswell Books on June 15th. So check out the Boswell book site. And that's with the author of that book that's in the left-hand corner, Architects of an American Landscape. And it is the story of Olmsted and Henry Hobson Richardson. I highly recommend it. I have read it. It's a delightful read. And then this coming weekend on Sunday, May 22nd at 3 and 7:30, there will be Wild Space Dance Company will be performing in Washington Park. They do many site-specific dances, and this is one that's really going to be exciting along the lagoon and near the band shell in Washington Park. And then I will also be doing some walks and talks in Washington Park this summer as James walks in June, and then before about half of the Washington Park Wednesdays concerts, and those will be announced, the dates and times on the Washington Park Wednesdays website and other publicity that they're doing. So I also recommend, if you haven't seen the Frederick Law Olmsted Designing America film, it's a PBS documentary that is just wonderful. It really gives a very just a beautiful and profound documentary about Olmsted's influence in America. And that is free. It's available just by going to PBS. It's also on some other streaming sites, but you can get it, you can just download it through the PBS website. And with that, I would highly recommend that everyone go to the Olmsted 200 website. The theme is celebrating parks for all people. This is the wonderful, colorful logo of Olmsted in all of his diversity. And there are so many programs there. There are webinars, there are articles and pictures, and it really gives a real breadth of what Olmsted, his influence has been and continues to be throughout the country, and also as well as in some other countries like Canada, primarily Canada and the United States. So with that, I thank you all for joining us this evening, and we'll have time to field a few questions. And Grace has been checking the chat in the Q&A, so we'll let her take those questions, and I'll do my best to answer them.
That was great, Virginia. Thank you so much. I'm a big fan of our parks, and the parks along the lakefront are fantastic. I happen to have gotten married in one of them. So I think this is just
right. I knew that. Yes. And then we bicycled from one park to another.
We did. Yeah, we did basically an Olmsted tour. So big fan for sure. So one question was, and I think that you kind of answered this question already, but there's a follow-up. Were the water features in Washington Park, Central Park, natural or man-made? And it sounds like, at least with Washington Park, man-made, correct?
Correct. And there are a number of lagoons in Milwaukee's parks that are they are fed, with city water for the most part. Yes, those were human-made lagoons. And as far as Central Park, a lot of Central Park, the feature that's the most that was the most original was the rock ledge. But other than that, it was a swamp, and it was not. Olmsted said it was one of the most inhospitable places for a park you could have chosen, but it was centrally located. That was its biggest feature.
So the follow-up question, it sounds like the source of water is city water in the case of like Washington Park, for example.
Yes.
I do know that they have a whole established ecosystem there now, and people go and fish, and the Urban Ecology Center is located there. So it's become its own sort of natural.
Right. And there is a plan. There's a study there's been a couple of studies, and there's a recent one at options to restore the health of the lagoon even more. So it's a project, and there's other lagoons that that need attention. I think there's a lot of updating that could be done with that.
Another question is regarding Olmsted's decision for what plants he selected, whether he was like interested in plants from the East in the Midwest because of that's where he was from, but it sounds like you said he was also able to do a lot of site-specific work.
Well, there's a lot of different stories that I've heard about plant selection. Olmsted himself was very attentive to plants, but that was not his primary forte in terms of like what he was focusing on. It was, so he would have, like, certainly in Milwaukee's case, Warren Manning had more to do with that. Now there was, at that time, the issue of native plants, people were paying attention to it somewhat, but they weren't always aware of the role, the impact of native plants versus others. And actually, several people have told me there really was not such a thing as what we call invasive species, which actually take over. That happened later. And so, but he would be attentive to the fact that, say, you wouldn't just put plants in just for their because you liked that plant, you had to pay attention to what was suited. Suitability was a very big thing for Olmsted. And so the idea also was to have them be low maintenance. He was really not in favor of high maintenance plants, and bedding plants at that time were very popular. It was a Victorian trend, and he was not in favor of these very intensive planted places that took a lot of energy to maintain. And so that's why the naturalistic look, even though some people say, well, grass is high maintenance too, but at the time, a lot, sometimes there were other ways of maintaining grass that we don't, we're kind of hung up on this, like it has to be mowed exactly this length and this and that, but I hope that answers it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a lot, I mean, there's a whole thing about how they chose Warren Manning as a proponent of native plants. He certainly, I've read some in his book, the book about him talked about that he certainly selected some trees and such that were definitely native to Wisconsin as opposed to, or the Midwest. And as I said, I mean, the choices of trees, like I know that in the East, that would be maples. That was very common, or there's, birches and other things. So a lot of the landscapes did reflect the regionality.
Mm-hmm. I imagine it would also be restricted by what you could easily access at that time too, which would tend to be more local.
Right.
Somebody asked, I think this is maybe a little bit rhetorical, but if you want to speak to the idea of how we can get young people excited about Olmsted's legacy and teaching, school-age children about Olmsted. I will mention, I'll put a shout out there for Historic Milwaukee does have a book geared towards kids about Olmsted's legacy that was recently published.
Oh, right. That's one. There's one about Central Park, I think. And there's several books. There's at least 3 that I know of that are books about Olmsted that are geared towards school-age children. And I would say one of the things that I think is I think his story is very interesting. I think it needs to be geared towards the age, but certainly the idea of being in nature and what it feels like to be in nature. I think this is what Olmsted was all about. He wanted people to enjoy being in nature and observing things and being, having that respite. Now, as far as depending on which age you're talking about, I think also that Olmsted is really relevant today because of how much he was focused on equity. And more people are writing about that in detail or having discussions and such, because I think we are more aware than ever about what it means for all people to be included. And he had this, I think it was his travels in the South that really helped him to understand what it means to be inclusive of all people. And to the extent of that he saw that the inhumanity that was being done to enslaved people, that people were also treating each other that way in the South, which is an interesting observation. It wasn't just that a certain people were being treated inhumanely. And so I think that it's a model for how we can begin to see what the value is of treating all people respectfully and inclusive, and more than inclusively, like saying this is for everyone.
Great. Question, kind of the question around inclusivity and recognition. Joyce asked if you recognized Indian mounds at the time. Whether
he did.
Yeah.
That is not known, and it has been studied a bit. No one can quite, now, I mean, it was incorporated within the park, but there were some that were not incorporated. So to what extent this is not known, and that could be one of the blind spots of Olmsted, and certainly of all the people of his era. I mean, let's face it, Americans were really into erasing and replacing, and there was no question that that was some of what happened also in Central Park, which happened before, again, Olmsted was on site even or involved. But there is probably the thing that we need to learn from is what happens when you don't respect the history of landscape and people, but especially of people. And this is where there's more of an effort now, I think, to understand that landscapes are cultural as well as physical. And so what is a cultural landscape? And this is accumulated history within a place. And this is, I think that Olmsted certainly had an appreciation for the fact that Americans at the time when he was coming of age, they were eager to kind of just wipe out anything. Like they were starting to wipe out Niagara Falls and just put factories up around it. And he went on a real campaign to change that. And he did, he succeeded. So his focus may have been more on things like scenery, but it was also on the sense that would anything be considered special or worthy of protecting?
Great. I just want to note that we're a little bit after 7, but we'll take a couple more questions if you're still good on time, Virginia.
Sure, I'm fine. I'm more than fine.
Somebody asked about a number of trees being taken down recently in Lake Park. I don't know if you are familiar with that.
Yes, I am aware, and as sad as it is for me and for all of us, it is a result of the emerald ash borer primarily, and possibly other diseased trees. But the emerald ash borer is just a blight that once it infects a tree, and it is infecting pretty much ash trees, throughout Wisconsin. It started in the east. I remember when I was at Fine Gardening, and it was 20 some years ago. We were watching as it moved from state to state, and once it reaches somewhere, so those trees, if they weren't cut down, they would eventually be endangering of some, falling over. So that's why they were cut down, sadly. And there's as many as, there's in the hundreds that have been cut down, in Lake Park. But there is work to replace them. There's also some federal money that is coming for tree replacement in Milwaukee. So follow that. And I don't know the exact plan, but I do know that I've heard that there is money for replacement of trees. And I think trees are one of the most important things that we need to tend in all of our public spaces and our streets and everything, because climate issues, shade, it's actually been shown that where there's trees, there's lower crime. So, there's just all kinds of things. But yes, Olmsted was a huge proponent of trees. There's a whole book that just is coming out called Olmsted Trees. Then someone came and photographed them here in Milwaukee as well as in all the Olmsted parks.
Neat. So let's end with this question. Did Olmsted have a favorite park that he designed?
Yes, as a matter of fact, and it's Prospect Park in New York, in Brooklyn, I mean. He liked Central Park, and it was very popular, but he and Vaux both felt that they could achieve their design goals most effectively in Prospect Park. The scale was a little bit smaller. It was also where they created the first parkway that moved into the park, which is called Eastern Parkway. And I just had the pleasure of spending a whole day there last summer, and I had just been in the park a few times before that, but never felt like I had really been able to experience it fully. And it is wonderfully used, and just, it's a wonderful park. I encourage you to visit if you get a chance. But I really love Central Park myself, and I love our parks. I truly think that Olmsted probably was the kind of person that loved the park he was working on at the time the most.
Yeah. Well, Virginia, this has been great. Thank you so much for taking the time to celebrate this 200th birthday with us. I encourage everybody to check out this olmsted200.org, and we'll email out the recording of this program, and definitely take some time to go out and enjoy all of Milwaukee's parks and support all of what Milwaukee County is doing to preserve our parks too.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to Historic Milwaukee for all that you're doing. And we will be doing some other programs together. So stay tuned.
Absolutely. Stay tuned, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
Okay, bye-bye.